Chapter 4. We had planned to go in as soon as possible to get our school organized. Now, needing grub, we could make one trip count double. Accordingly, Daddy hitched up Johnny and went to town to demand that the state organize a school district and build a school for us. What a disappointment he met. I think it's human nature to believe that what one wants to believe. When Mr. Ferris had told me, "You have children enough to move into a sagebrush any place and demand the state erect a school for you," I believed it because I wanted to believe it. I was gloriously happy in believing it, so I never questioned his word or looked into the matter further, and I'm glad I didn't, for if I had, we never would have homesteaded. But here we were, all moved in and settled, and it was rather late to learn we couldn't get a school. When Daddy went to see the commissioners, he was met with, "Oh, I'm afraid there's been a big mistake. You were certainly misinformed. It requires 7 children to organize new district, 5 of school age and 3 in regular daily attendance." Daddy took their information as final, bought the groceries, and drove home. The most depressed and dejected person I'd ever seen. Now the trouble of moving was over, and with my optimism and encouragement, he had begun to think that if we got a school, we could stay, and our homestead would be a success. Now his hopes were dashed to the ground. Without a school, it was impossible to stay. Depressed as he was, however, my dear old boy was more worried about my disappointment than he was concerned with his own. He came in, put his arms around me, and said, "Oh, lady, we're licked. We can't get a school. It's through no fault of our own, but we're licked. We'll just have to call it a nice summer's vacation, and when fall comes, we'll pack our little doll rags and go back to town." "But, Daddy, we can't go back. We've nothing to go back to, and nothing to go back on." We've all heard about the man who had the bear by the tail and couldn't let go. Well, that was us. Besides, I wasn't licked. Call it faith, call it intuition, or just plain cussed stubbornness. Maybe that's what it was. But whatever it was, I had it. I never for a moment thought I wasn't going to get a school. I know very well that if the shoe had been on the other foot, so to speak, if it had been some project of Daddy's that had failed, especially one I had not been in favor of, I could not have resisted one little dig. So, one "I told you so," but not so with Daddy. He was concerned with my disappointment. I thought there may have been some mistake. Surely AJ could have been more forceful in presenting his case. Something would turn up. There must be. There was some way out. I was racking my brain, trying to think. We had 5 children now. If we just had 2 more, that would be it. Then I realized by the time the next 2 unborn babies were old enough to go to school, the 2 older ones would be too old to draw rural school money. I had to abandon that plan. It wouldn't work. I'd never be able to have babies fast enough to catch up with that school district. I still would not accept defeat. Accordingly, I made plans for a trip to Reno the following week, after Johnny had a rest. On next Monday, I put up lunch to eat at 20 Mile House. We made it a must to stop there and have a cup of hot coffee. The 35-mile trip always required at least 10 hours of slow, steady driving. A hot lunch on the way was a wonderful pickup for the hot trip. I had baked bread and left everything in readiness for Daddy and the children while I would be gone the 3 days. It always took 1 day to drive in, 1 day to shop and transact any business, and 1 day to drive home. Now I was ready, my lunch in a bag. I had climbed into the wagon and picked up the lines when Daddy, who had all the while protested what he called a useless trip, came out. Leaning his foot on the hub of the wagon wheel, he looked up at me and said, "Old lady, that's a long, hard trip to town. What in the hell do you think you can accomplish that I haven't already done?" "I don't know, Daddy. I only know we've got to get a school, and we've got to have a school, and I'm betting we get one." I hit old Johnny a crack and moved on, happy in the thought that some way we would have a school. I drove slowly along the sandy road, and after 5 hours arrived at 20 Mile House. There was no county crew here now. I went in and started a fire and made a cup of tea. The old place smelled of wood rats, as most vacant places in the hills do, so I went out to the doorstep to eat my lunch. Just then a fellow with a 4-horse team and wagon drove up and stopped at the well to water his horses. I called out, "Hi, mister. Come have lunch with me." He was a stranger that I had never seen before. Many people have asked, "Weren't you afraid to speak to a stranger way out there in the desert 20 miles from another human being?" I'm glad to say I wasn't. That kind of fear was left out of my makeup. It was a cheery invitation. I called out to him to join me, and he came. I filled the teacup I had brought along and handed it to him with one of the sandwiches I'd packed, and we settled down to eat. I drank out of the tea can. Doctors would call our ensuing conversation case history. To us, it was just desert gossip and information. We asked each other's names, where we lived, and our occupations. He was a teamster hauling freight and an old-timer out here. In fact, he'd been born out there. I told him where we were homeschooling and my problem about a school, and that I was on my way to see the county commissioners to try and find a way to establish the school. In his drawling voice, he said, "Now, ain't that a piece of good luck? My mother over there at the Pyramid School District just been notified she'll lose her school if more children don't come into her district by September 1st. She only has 2 children left to school age. If you'll join districts with her, you can divide the funds, which is $1,000 a year, and then each of you can hold 5 months school. Mother expects to sell out this coming summer, so if you can get the school organized before she sells, you'll fall heir to the whole school fund. Just go in and have the commissioners extend the district lines to include your homestead." That would be a 20-mile stretch. Could I get them to do it? The rest of the long trip fled like magic. I was there, then presto, I was here, then presto, I was there. So I was so filled with wondrous emotions that I never noticed the hard trip. The commissioners were meeting that evening, and I was there to present my case, but to my great concern, I met disappointment at every turn. The head spokesman threw up his hands and said, "Moving district lines is out of our jurisdiction. We have nothing to do with it. Go see old Charlie Stoddard at the courthouse." I couldn't see him till the next morning. Of course, I was up early the next day, parading up and down, waiting for the doors of the courthouse to open. Mr. Stoddard, who was county recorder, only repeated the same thing. "I've nothing at all to do with it. Go see old Bill Fogg." Mr. Fogg was our county clerk, way down at the other end of the business district, with an office in the post office on Commercial Row. When I saw him, the same performance was repeated, only more so. He was a slim, elderly fellow who had lost his voice, making it impossible for him to speak above a whisper. But he could pound good and loud on his desk, which he did. He now said, with all the strength and vehemence he could muster, "I'll have nothing to do with it. Pyramid School District has moved around the desert from one rock to another after that old woman for the last 20 years. Great expense to the county. I'll have nothing to do with it." He turned and walked away, but after taking a few steps, he turned again and shouted as nearly as he could, "Go see old man Bray." Mr. Bray, I learned, was our school superintendent and lived at the north end of town, 10 blocks away. I was afoot and had done all this running around in my own power, which was beginning to weaken a little, but my faith was still intact. This Mr. Bray might be a little more favorable toward my project. It was with this hope and a little prayer that I knocked on his door. Mr. Bray answered my knock. I introduced myself and stated my business, telling him of my visits to different people and how each had passed the buck, so to speak. "The commissioners said go see old Charlie Stoddard," I explained. "Old Charlie Stoddard said go see old Bill Fogg, and old Bill Fogg said go see old man Bray. Will you please tell me, are you the old man Bray that I want to see?" By this time we were both laughing. "Yes, I think I am. Come in and we'll talk it over. I'm your school superintendent, and I sent Miss Bonus the notice on her school at Pyramid Lake would be closed this fall. We'll see what can be done." I was jubilant. That was the first word of encouragement I had heard since the day before when talking to the teamster. I told him of our plans. We had 5 children. I added 3 of school age. He already knew of Mrs. Bennett's 2. That made 7 needed for a district. Could we be allowed to stretch the district lines 20 miles? I told him Mrs. Bennett was considering selling out, so if we could get the district established before she sold, we would fall out to the whole school fund. He listened attentively and then pointed out there was a little technical point there, that of stretching the lines 20 miles. The reason they'd all passed the buck on to the next was that none of them had wanted to accept that responsibility. Mr. Fogg had been right, for the old lady had cost the county a lot of money for surveying each time she took a notion to move. But as she always had enough children of her own, she'd been able to demand a school, and there was nothing that they could do but survey a new district and move the old schoolhouse to a new location. This time she'd run out of children, and she was requesting a favor, which they were reluctant to grant. This, however, was different. I was a newcomer with a brood of children that needed an education. After some careful thought, Mr. Bray said, "We'll just declare the pyramid school lines extended to take in Old's Homestead. We needn't put the county to the expense of surveying it. I will appoint you the district clerk, Miss Benna's the president, and I will be the third trustee and sign all the school warrants. You'll have to erect your own building, for the state can only pay the teacher's salary. We'll spend half the fun on your side of the mountain and half on Miss Bennett's." So there, that easily we had our school. I believe God had opened the way. I was so anxious to get home with my news that I could scarcely contain myself, but old Johnny needed a rest after the long ride, and I had another errand.